They said a face like hers would scare the children. 3 households had turned her away before noon, each one finding the same kind word to hide the same cruel truth. We've filled the position. Now she stood alone on the church steps in Pell's Crossing, Kansas, watching wagons roll home in the August dusk, clutching a folded notice for work that no longer existed for a woman who looked like her. Ruth Calloway knew the truth. She was the woman nobody wanted, until a little girl no taller than a fence post walked straight up to her, slipped a small hand into her ruined one, and changed the shape of everything that came after. Stay with me to the end, and tell me in the comments what town you're listening from. I want to know how far this story carries. The heat came up off the dirt street in waves, and Ruth could feel it through the thin soles of her boots. She had walked into Pell's Crossing that morning with 11 cents, and a reference letter so worn the creases had gone soft as cloth. The letter said she was honest, clean, hardworking, a fine hand with sick folk, and a finer hand with a needle. The letter did not say what the left side of her face would say for her before she ever opened her mouth. The burn had taken her cheek, her ear, the smooth of her jaw, and the back of one hand the night the lamp tipped and the little house went up like dry straw, the night her husband did not come out. That was 3 years gone now, 3 years of doors. She had learned to read the moment a stranger's eyes found the scar, the way the gaze caught and then fled, the way the mouth pressed flat, the way the body half turned as if her bad luck might be catching. The widow Tilden had needed a housekeeper until she opened her front door. The grocer had needed a girl for the counter until he looked up from his ledger. By the time the church bell rang 5, Ruth had stopped asking. She had simply sat down on the warm stone steps because her feet hurt and because she had nowhere left to walk to. Maybe there's something wrong with me, she thought, not for the first time. Maybe they can see it written on me plain as the scar. Unwanted. She had 11 cents and no supper and no bed, and the sky over the wheat was turning the color of a bruise. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, the way her mother had taught her, but the words would not come. They never did anymore. That was when she felt the small fingers close around hers. Ruth's eyes opened. A child had crossed the empty square and stopped in front of her, a little girl of maybe 6, barefoot, her brown hair half out of its braid, her face streaked with the clean tracks of recent crying. And the girl had taken Ruth's hand, the scarred one, the one grown men would not shake, and she held it as though it were nothing remarkable at all. Ruth went very still. She had learned not to move quick around children because their mothers had usually taught them already to be afraid of faces like hers. But this child only looked up at her with wet, serious eyes and said, "I lost my uncle. He told me to wait by the wagons, but they all started looking the same, and then it got dark and he wasn't there." Her chin shook. "Will you help me find him?" Ruth opened her mouth, then closed it. "What's your name?" she asked at last, gently. "Sadie," the girl said. She wiped her nose with her free arm but did not let go of Ruth's hand. Then she did the thing that broke something loose in Ruth's chest. She reached into the pocket of her pinafore and drew out a battered tin, the kind that once held tobacco, and pried off the lid. Inside, nested like seeds, were buttons of every shape and color, bone and brass and painted wood. "This one's for you," Sadie said, and pressed a small blue button into Ruth's palm. "What is it for?" Ruth managed. "It's a kindness button," Sadie said, as if it were obvious. "You get one when somebody's kind to you. You held my hand and you didn't tell me to go away." Ruth stared down at the little blue circle in the cup of her scarred hand and felt her eyes burn for the first time in longer than she could remember. The whole town had flinched from that hand all day. This child had filled it. "Sadie?" A man's voice cut across the square, rough with fear. "Sadie, where are you?" The girl spun, her face splitting into relief. "Uncle Daniel." He came toward them at an uneven gait, a tall man favoring his right leg, his hat shoved back, his eyes wild the way only a frightened guardian's can be. He dropped to one knee and gathered the child against his chest, and over her head his gaze rose and found Ruth. Here it comes, she thought, bracing the way she always braced. The flinch. The cooling. The question of what such a creature was doing holding his niece's hand. But the man only looked at her steady, taking in the scar without his face changing at all, and said, "Thank you. I've been looking near half an hour, I thought." His voice caught. "Thank you." Ruth realized she was still holding the blue button. "She found me," Ruth said. "I only sat still." He stood, keeping one hand on Sadie's shoulder. She saw him take in the rest of her then, the worn dress, the reference letter gone limp in her lap, the way she sat on church steps at supper time with nowhere to be. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps her own age, with a tiredness around the eyes that she recognized because she wore the same tiredness herself. "You waiting on somebody?" he asked. "No," Ruth said. "Family in town. No. Work." She almost laughed. "I came for a housekeeping notice. It seems the notice changed its mind about me." She lifted her chin a little. "I'll manage." It was the lie she always told. Daniel Mercer was quiet a moment. Then he said something she did not expect. "I keep the livery on the south end. It's me and Sadie since my sister passed in the spring. House is too much for me with the leg, and the girl needs a woman's hand more than I can give her." He paused, and she saw him weigh it. "I can't pay much. Room, board, and whatever's fair on top when there's anything left over. It's honest work and it's a roof. You're welcome to it, at least till you find better." Ruth looked at him, really looked, and found no pity in his face, no charity dressed up as goodness. Only weariness, the kind that matched her own, and something steadier underneath it. "Why would you do that?" she said. "For a woman you found on the steps. You don't know me." Daniel's mouth tugged, not quite a smile. "I know my niece took your hand," he said. "She doesn't take to strangers, not since her mama." He shifted his weight off the bad leg. "And let's just say I know what it's like to be looked at like you're trouble for breathing." There was a whole life in the rough of those words. Ruth heard it. And she was so tired, and the sky was nearly dark, and Sadie was watching her with her tin still open, and that hope no one had taught her to hide. "Just till I find better," Ruth said. "Just till then," Daniel agreed. And Sadie whooped so loud a dog barked 2 streets over. The Mercer place sat low against a stand of cottonwoods at the edge of town, the livery in front and a small frame house behind, both of them clean and both of them clearly fighting a losing fight. Ruth saw it in the daylight the next morning, the way a person sees a thing they mean to mend. A fence railed down, a roof patched with mismatched shingle, stalls half empty where there should have been horses earning their keep. Inside the house was tidy but worn thin, the shelves a little too bare, the way a place looks when things have been sold off one at a time. And everywhere the marks of a woman and a child who were no longer there. A christening gown folded on a high shelf. A man's wedding photograph turned to face the room, a young Daniel beside a smiling woman with a baby in her arms. "My wife," he said when he caught Ruth looking. "Mary, and our boy. We lost them both the same night near 3 years back. The baby wouldn't come right." He said it plain, the way men say the things that have worn smooth from being carried so long. "Then this spring my sister took the consumption and Sadie came to me, so you see how it is." Ruth did see. She had buried her own people 1 and 2 at a time. She did not offer him empty words. She only said, "I'm sorry," and meant it, and then she rolled up her sleeves and went to work. And work she did. She scrubbed the floors and turned the mattresses and dug the weeds out of the kitchen garden that had gone to ruin. She mended Daniel's torn shirts and let out the hems of Sadie's dresses, which the child was outgrowing faster than anyone had time to notice. She found the herbs she needed growing wild along the creek, yarrow and elderflower and willow, the medicine her mother had pressed into her hands before the fever took her, and she dried them in bundles from the kitchen rafters. The first real test came a week in, when Sadie woke flushed and crying with a fever that climbed through the afternoon. Daniel went gray at the sight of it, because fever was the word that had emptied his whole life, and Ruth saw the old terror rise in him. "Get me the willow bark and clean cloths and cool water, not cold," she said, calm as creek water, and he obeyed because someone calm was telling him what to do. She brought the fever down through the long hours of the night, sponging the small wrists and the backs of the small knees, murmuring low until the child slipped from thrashing into true rest. When dawn came and Sadie's skin had cooled, Daniel sat down hard in the kitchen chair and put his face in his hand, and his shoulders shook once, and then he mastered it. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. "I didn't know what to do. I never know what to do." "You sat with her," Ruth said. "That's half of it." After that, the days fell into a rhythm that surprised her with how natural it felt. Coffee at first light, the two of them quiet at the table while the town still slept. Daniel out to the stalls, Ruth to the house and the garden and the girl. Lessons by lamplight in the evening, Ruth teaching Sadie her letters out of the one book she owned. And the buttons. Every kindness earned a button. The day Ruth braided Sadie's hair without pulling a button. The day Daniel carried the child on his shoulders all the way to the creek though his leg ached a button. The tin filled slow and steady, and Ruth came to understand that the child was keeping a ledger the whole town had refused to keep, a careful accounting of every time the world had been gentle, as if she meant to prove it could be. It could not last untroubled, of course. Such things never do. The trouble came on a bright September morning in a black coat, in the person of Augustus Pell, who had given the town its name and never let it forget. He was a tall, silver man with soft, well-fed hands and the kind of face that had been handsome before comfort softened it, and he arrived in a lacquered buggy with a lawyer beside him. He did not get down. He looked at the worn house and the half-empty stalls and the scarred woman in the doorway, and his lip curled the smallest amount, and then he smiled, which was worse. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I've come about my granddaughter." Sadie's mother had been his daughter, Ruth would learn, the one who'd married a railroad man against her father's wishes and been cut off for it, the one who had died in the spring in a rented room while her wealthy father sat in his big house across the county and did not come. But Augustus Pell did not speak of any of that. He spoke of duty. He spoke of what a child was owed. "Look at this place," he said, gentle as a sermon. A crippled man his eyes touched Ruth's face and slid away, a hired woman of uncertain situation raising a little girl in want. I can give the child everything, schooling back east, fine dresses, a future. Surely even you can see she belongs with her own blood in a proper home. And the terrible thing, the thing that lay like a stone in Ruth's stomach for days afterward, was how reasonable it sounded. How the lawyer nodded. How, when word spread through Pell's Crossing, half the town nodded too, because of course the rich grandfather wanted only the best, and of course the poor cripple and the burned stranger were no fit place for a Pell. Augustus Pell filed his petition with the county that same week. A hearing was set before the circuit judge for the last Friday of the month. If Daniel Mercer could not show himself a fit and proper guardian, Sadie would be taken from the only home she had left and handed to the man who had let her mother die alone. The clock began to tick, and it ticked loud in that small house. Ruth did not sleep much in the nights that followed, and neither did Daniel. She heard him moving in the dark, heard the creak of his chair by Sadie's door. The despair came off him like cold off a window. "Maybe he's right," Daniel said at last, late one night by the dying fire, his voice flat and hollow. "Maybe she would be better off. What do I have to give her? A failing livery, a bad leg, a house I can barely keep. He's got money and a name and the whole town in his pocket. I'm not," his jaw worked, "I'm not enough, Ruth, I never have been." And Ruth, who had spent her whole life being told she was not enough, felt something flare up in her, hot and clean. "Listen to me," she said, and took his face in her scarred hands and made him look at her. "That man let his own daughter die in a rented room 2 miles from his door because she married for love instead of money. He did not come when she was dying. He did not come for the burying. And now she's dead and there's land in it, isn't there? A trust." She had heard it whispered, pieced it together. Sadie's mother had owned a quarter section, left to the child to be held until she came of age. The one thing the railroad man had managed to put in his wife's name. He doesn't want a little girl, Daniel. He wants that land, and the child is the lock on the door. He'll take her and he'll send her so far east she'll forget she ever had an uncle, and he'll farm that quarter and never think of her again. Daniel stared at her. "You can't know that." "I know men who flinch from what costs them and reach for what pays them," Ruth said. "I've been the thing they flinch from my whole life. I know exactly how it looks." And then, because the hour was late and they might lose everything in a week and she was done protecting herself, she said the rest of it. "I came to this town with 11 cents and no place in the world. Your girl took my hand when nobody else would touch it. You gave me a roof when you had barely enough roof for yourselves. I don't want better anymore, Daniel. There is no better. This is the only place I've ever been wanted, and I am not going to stand by and watch a rich man take it apart. Daniel's eyes were wet. He covered her scarred hand with his own and did not pull away. "I've been afraid to say it," he said, "what you've become to us." "Then don't say it yet," Ruth whispered. "Say it after, when we've won." So she fought. The next morning Ruth put on her one good dress and walked back into the town that had turned her away, and this time she did not go to the front doors. She went to the back ones, to the poor end, to the families on the wrong side of the tracks, because those were the people she had quietly tended in her weeks at the Mercer place without ever telling Daniel she'd done it. She had set the Hollies boy's broken arm when his folks couldn't pay the doctor. She had sat up 2 nights with old Mrs. Ockhaffer's daughter through a hard birth and brought them both through. She had dosed half a dozen children through the same fever that nearly took Sadie, asking nothing. Now she stood in those doorways with her scar plain in the daylight and asked for the only thing she'd ever asked of that town. "There's a hearing Friday," she said. "A good man is going to lose his little girl to a rich one who doesn't want her. If you've got a true word to say about how Daniel Mercer treats that child, or about me, I'm asking you to come say it to the judge." She braced for the doors to close the way doors had always closed. They did not close. One by one, the people she had helped looked at her scarred face and saw at last not the scar but the hands that had healed them. "We'll be there," said the Hollies woman. "Course we will." And while Ruth gathered her witnesses, the lawyer Augustus Pell had hired, a younger man with a conscience not yet fully spent, let slip to the county clerk what was written in the trust papers, and the county clerk, who owed Daniel for a winter of free stabling, made sure Ruth knew. A quarter section, held for the child, reverting to the nearest guardian's control until she came of legal age. It was exactly as she had said. The hearing was held in the long room above the feed store, and on Friday morning it was full. That was the first thing Augustus Pell noticed when he arrived in his black coat, and Ruth watched the surprise cross his face like a cloud. The room was full of the poor end of Pell's crossing, the Hollises and the Ockhafors and a dozen more, scrubbed and silent and waiting. The judge was a tired man from the circuit who had seen every kind of human grasping. He let Augustus Pell speak first, and Pell spoke beautifully, of blood and duty and the future he could give. Then the judge said, "Who speaks for the guardian?" and the room stood up. They stood up one after another, and they told it plain. How the crippled man had never once raised his voice to the child. How the burned woman had walked through their doors when the doctor wouldn't and asked for nothing. How Sadie Mercer was the best-loved child on the south end of town. And when the judge asked, almost idle, whether anyone could speak to the matter of the late mother's estate, Ruth rose. Her voice shook only at the start. She told the court about the trust, about the quarter section, about a daughter who died 2 miles from her father's house with no one coming. "He never visited her sick," Ruth said into the dead quiet room. "He never came to bury her. He has not, to my knowledge, embraced that child one time. But there is land, Your Honor, and the child is the key to it, and that is the only reason that man is in this room." Augustus Pell came up out of his chair red to the collar, sputtering, and in his anger he said the thing that ended it. The girl would be sent to the Hartwell School in Boston where she belongs and the property managed properly until, and he caught himself, but it was a half-second too late and the whole room had heard the order of his loving. The school first, the property second. The child nowhere in it at all. The judge set down his pen. He did not take long. The child, he said, would remain with her uncle, Daniel Mercer, whose fitness the community had affirmed beyond any doubt he had ever seen in such a room. The trust would be supervised by the county on the child's behalf, beyond the reach of any party who stood to gain. And Augustus Pell could take his buggy back across the county and trouble these people no further. Sadie, who had sat the whole time between Ruth and Daniel with her tin clutched in both hands, looked up and whispered, "Does that mean Miss Ruth gets to stay forever?" And Daniel laughed, a broken, joyful sound, and could not answer. He answered properly later, of course, after the room had emptied and the people had pressed their rough hands to Ruth's and gone home. He answered it on the steps of the very church where Ruth had once sat certain that no one in the world would ever want her. There was no preacher fool enough to make trouble over a scarred woman and a crippled man, So they spoke their own words under the cottonwoods at the edge of the Mercer place when the wheat had gone gold for the harvest, witnessed by the families who had stood up when it counted. "I used to be the woman nobody wanted," Ruth said, her ruined hands held fast in Daniel's. "The one every door closed against. But I am done waiting to be chosen. I choose you, Daniel Mercer. I choose this girl. I choose this stubborn, leaning, half-mended house, and I will keep choosing it every morning I have left. I choose you too," Daniel said, his voice thick. "The bravest woman I ever met walked into this town with 11 cents and saved everything I have." The livery began to fill again that autumn, because folk who had stood in that hot room above the feed store found they would rather give their business to the Mercers than to anyone, and a man's leg matters less when his neighbors decide he's one of their own. The roof got mended, the fence got mended, Sadie got taller, and one evening near the end of harvest, the girl climbed into Ruth's lap with her tin and pried off the lid and dug to the very bottom, where a single button sat apart from all the rest, mother of pearl worn smooth, the one she never let anyone touch. "This was my first mama's," Sadie said softly. "Off her good dress. It's the most precious one." And she took Ruth's scarred hand, the same hand she had reached for on the church steps when the whole town flinched, and she pressed the pearl button into the cup of it and closed Ruth's fingers over it. "I want you to have it," she said, "because you're my mama now too." Ruth Calloway, who had been certain to her bones that she was a thing the world would always turn from, sat very still and held a dead woman's button and a living child against her, and understood at last the truth she had spent her whole life trying to learn. She had thought salvation came from being wanted. She had sat on those steps and prayed to be chosen, and no one had chosen her, and she had believed that meant she was worthless. But that was never how it worked. A little girl with a tin of buttons had taught her better. You are not saved by being wanted. You are saved in the moment you find the courage to hold on, when someone smaller and more frightened than you reaches out a hand for the one part of you that you were sure no one could ever bear to touch. The reaching back is the whole of it. Outside, the Kansas wind moved through the gold wheat with a sound like water, and the lamps glowed warm in a leaning house that no one could take from them now, and inside it a family that the world had thrown away held on to one another and did not let go. It was not